Hey everybody, welcome to today's Wednesday workshop. I am talking today about the silent killer of employee engagement. So happy to have you joining me here, whether you're catching me live or on the replay. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and I am an expert in organizational development and behavioral change. With my business partner, Ann Dranitsaris, we run an organization called Caliber Leadership Systems, where we work with organizations to help them navigate some of the natural inherent challenges of organizational life. And over the last few weeks, and in fact, the last few months, I've been talking about a number of different dysfunctions, right? Specifically, dysfunctions that we see in leaders. Today's focus is on low emotional intelligence. So what is this all about? Why does it happen? What's the impact in organizations? So you really can start to look at and understand certain things that are going on in your organization through that lens of leadership dysfunction. And I'm going to leave you with some really practical tips on things that you can start doing right away in your organization to address this silent killer of employee engagement. Now, there has never been a time when emotionally intelligent leaders were more important or more relevant than right now, right? That ability that emotionally intelligent leaders have to create that sense of belonging, to really empathize with employees through their experience, and engage not only their minds, but also and their bodies, but their hearts as well in what it is that they're doing. And this is so critical, and yet it's still overlooked in most leadership training. Not quite like it was in the past, but still something that a lot of leaders don't think about and they don't get to. Employees today are looking to their leaders to create psychological safety. And if leaders don't actually know what this means, or they've even dismissed it as perhaps a current fad, it's really time to take it seriously and circle back and have these conversations in your organization and with other leaders about what you're doing in order to create that psychological safety that employees need today, okay? Because otherwise, if we're not taking it seriously, again, the leaders are going to be the ones that fall victim to the Great Resignation. Psychological safety, really what that means, it's about an absence of interpersonal fear. When psychological safety is present, people can speak up. They can speak up about work-related relevant content. They can speak up about some of the challenges. They can even speak up about some of the things that aren't going well, right? That's psychological safety, that not having to pretend or blame or, push it out, because I know that I can have this conversation and I trust that my leaders are going to take care of me in that process. Organizations with leaders who are dismissing the importance of emotional intelligence and contribute to the absence of psychological safety for their employees. So again, if they're putting it out and saying, we don't need that, that's not important, that's not relevant to us, they actually then fuel that lack of psychological safety, which we know right now, especially as employees return to the workplace increasingly over the next few months, this is going to become really important because it has such a significant impact on employee engagement, on learning, right? The employee's ability to learn, to try new things, to innovate, to grow, even to solve problems and challenges, right? We need psychological security to look at things from that perspective of what's the solution, what are those options, really getting out of some of that self-protective behavior. The problem is, and what we see over and over again, and why we talk about the dysfunction of low emotional intelligence, is that most employees really most leaders don't understand this notion of how we're supposed to, as leaders, create psychological safety for our employees. So they don't understand it, nor do they really understand how to create it. What is it that I need to do as a leader in order to create psychological safety for my employees? Now, the benefits of emotional intelligence and psychological safety are well established. The research bears this out. But in fact, a new study indicates that just 26% of leaders out there are creating psychological safety for their employees. So that's a really small percentage. That means by far the majority of leaders are not creating an environment of psychological safety, and that is what contributes to and kills off employee engagement over time. It's only when we assess the emotional intelligence of leaders alongside of looking at engagement results that we really start to see that correlation, right? Where we've got low EI and low engagement results. And these two things go hand in hand. And again, if you've gone through the process of really looking at your engagement results and you're not getting where it is that you want to be from an organizational standpoint, this is one of the places to look at is the contributing factor, the driving factor that you've got leaders with low emotional intelligence. So again, this workshop is all about how important emotional intelligence is in our leaders in order for them to be able to create psychological safety in the workplace for employees. It's going to talk a little bit more about the impact of low emotional intelligence on employee engagement. So you really see how this bears out. I'm going to talk through some examples of different ways in which low EI shows up in the workplace. And interestingly, EI is on the decline in leaders. All the leaders that have come up, it's on the decline. People aren't looking at it. They're not training for it. They're not developing in people, but the need is greater. So while we might have muddled through in the past without it, with everything that we've been through over the last couple of years, that need for psychological safety and that sense of belonging, really feeling like I belong, is really important. And again, it's because there is still that low emotional intelligence and little is being done to bridge that gap between, they don't understand the need, nor do they understand their responsibility for meeting that need. And these are some of the important considerations. I mean, we hear leaders all the time with low EI saying things like, well, they don't need that, or they're not going to feel that, or that's not what they're going to experience, right? So that dismissing of it, because again, they don't want to have to get out of their own comfort zone and recognize and acknowledge that their emotional intelligence is low, and therefore that's why they're doing this and dismissing it. But it has a real serious consequence to the organization. The dysfunction of low emotional intelligence is what emerges, and all of its destructive symptoms are as a result. And if you're curious about some of those symptoms, check out the article that's being released tomorrow, specifically around this talk as well. So why is it? That despite all of these decades that we've been talking about emotional intelligence, and despite the fact that it is well known and well documented and well researched that emotional intelligence really does support employee satisfaction and engagement, why is it that leaders still aren't developing it, right? That's the big question. Why does it still remain low in most leaders despite the fact that it creates organizational dysfunction? Usually in our experience anyway, it's because leaders actually believe they are emotionally intelligent without having to have done any development. And it's really just because they say they are, right? They'll often say, of course I'm emotionally intelligent. I care about my employees. But what they really mean in that case is that, what their understanding of what EI really means and what it actually means is very, very different. There's a lot of complexity to it. And because leaders don't understand what it means, they've just made the decision that they are emotionally intelligent and that's the end of it. They don't really understand what it means, and they don't understand all of the different skills that are involved. And the fact that you can have some aspects of emotional intelligence that are really well developed and other aspects that are not developed at all. And that they have to develop them. They are skills that need to be developed. But again, if you think you're already emotionally intelligent, then there's no reason to develop it. And then we silently go along and kill off employee engagement. So emotional intelligence, this is why this is so important. When we talk about it in our clients, we make sure that working on emotional intelligence is a cornerstone of all of our Leadership Foundation programs. It's also a cornerstone of where we start off in our book, So You Think You Can Lead, with that understanding of self and that other awareness that's really critical in here. So emotional intelligence, bottom line, it is necessary for leadership effectiveness. It can be developed, so it's not static. It's not something we are born with. It is something that we develop. And ultimately no leader should be opting out nor be allowed to opt out of developing their own emotional intelligence. And really in organizations, we need to do a better job of making that connection between low EI and employee engagement. And what we see happen in organizations a lot of the times where they've got low employee engagement scores is they go after fixing things with programs or systems and don't actually look at the leadership behavior and the lack of EI that's actually contributing to it. And looking at that as a really significant way in which they can lever up their scores by raising the EI of their leaders and by ultimately creating those circumstances in which leaders are more effective at creating psychological safety for their employees, okay? So the reality is that emotions and emotional needs will negatively impact results, or they can get managed to improve outcomes, right? So we can direct our emotions in one of two ways, and that's why emotional intelligence is so important. And no matter how much leaders pretend that their emotions don't affect them, that they are in control of their emotions and there's no emotion driving their behavior or their choices or their decisions, the fact is, without emotional self-awareness, self-awareness, which of course we can't have emotional self-awareness if we have low EI. Without emotional self-awareness, no leader can possibly know just how much their emotions are affecting them, or they can't possibly know the impact that their own emotions are having on their behavior and also on how they are perceived by others. And while many will do a very good job of ignoring or disconnecting from emotions, the fact is that emotions are the driver. They are the driver of our behavior. And when these emotions are suppressed, as opposed to being understood and used productively, when our emotions are suppressed, it leads to subjective and reactive decision making. And that's what really starts to kill off our employee engagement, is that subjective and reactive decision making of the leaders. Too often leaders too, they hold that belief that our emotions are something to be controlled or ignored, and controlled in themselves or ignored in themselves and in others. And in our experience, again, while all of this information is out there around emotional intelligence, it is not being translated into leadership practices and organizational life. So we end up with this big gap, right, between what is needed from an emotional intelligence perspective in organizations and the reality of what is actually happening. Emotions are seen, interestingly enough, emotions are seen as contributing to workplace dysfunction and the lack of employee retention, poor productivity, all of that. But leaders are actually not owning their lack of emotional intelligence as the reason why emotions are being driven in the organization. Does that make sense? It's like, so we want to blame the emotions for all of these outcomes, but again, what's behind those emotions is the lack of EI in our leaders that creates the circumstances in which employees are having emotional experiences, which then translates into low morale, into poor productivity. But again, it all comes back to the level of emotional intelligence of the leader. Instead, what happens, and we see this again in leaders with low EI and in this dysfunction of low emotional intelligence, is they blame the employees, right? It's the employees' fault. They don't understand that they're lazy. They don't have to know how to manage themselves. They're getting upset for no reason. They have no common sense. Again, go into this place of blaming, because with low EI, you're not going in to empathize, to understand really have that awareness about the others and what other people need in order to maximize their productivity and their engagement. It's easier for them to think that an employee is, again, lazy, as opposed to recognizing that it's my own behavior as the leader because of my lack of EI that's causing them to feel demotivated, right? So these are the connections. They're very, very clear. And yet there is still so much resistance in leaders to developing up their emotional intelligence. And again, I can't say this enough. We always start with all of our works with our clients, whether it's through the coaching process, through the development programs, about self-awareness. Self-awareness is always that first pillar of leading with authority and authenticity. And if we don't have that self-awareness, of which, emotional intelligence, that's one of the cornerstones for emotional intelligence. If we don't have that cultivated, then again, we end up with low EI, and we can't have the impact in our organizations from a psychological safety perspective. And then it goes along to killing off employee engagement. So let me talk about 3 ways, as I always do in these workshops, 3 ways that the dysfunction of low emotional intelligence shows up in the workplace and ultimately kills employee engagement. And one of the ones I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start off in this notion of what translates out, the low EI translates out into permissive behavior. I have a client that I've worked with for many years, and they have an employee who is has a very different work style. And the leader, the VP, is because he doesn't get his need met by this employee in terms of how she behaves, how she responds to him, how she provides information and communicates, because he actually has to work at it, he has to figure out how to engage with her in a different way, he shifts into avoiding her and just letting her do whatever she feels like doing, however it is she feels like doing it. So moves into this permissiveness as opposed to leading, because he's not checking in with himself and saying, what is it that I'm feeling, right? So emotional intelligence, what is it that I'm feeling in my interactions with this employees, and how do I manage my experience and my feelings so that it's not causing me to withdraw and to shut down, which ultimately is what the employee to a degree is hoping will happen out of her self-protective system. And so we get into this dynamic where the employee is incredibly demotivated and disengaged because the leader's not leading. But he blames her as opposed to recognizing it's his inability to tolerate being in that experience with her. And so he just shuts down, he withdraws, and he ignores, and he gets busy and has all kinds of excuses why he can't meet. But in the reality is he's the leader in that situation. It's his responsibility to build up enough self-awareness and enough other awareness to figure out how to make this situation work for both of them. And so we see this in other cases too, where, the leader is, essentially if you've got an employee who perhaps is more emotive and more expressive, and the leader tolerating, that too much conversation, too much talk, people that are going on, giving too much detail, and not actually recognizing in themselves the need to, set boundaries to manage their impulse around it as well, right? And so we get into seeing with leaders with low EI is a ton of permissive behavior that shows up in a whole bunch of different ways. And when employees are not being led, when leaders are not exercising authority, where they are essentially providing a vacuum in which the employees are working, lack of psychological safety, they start to get more self-protective, and then we have this dysfunction of low EI that starts to emerge, right? So permissive behavior in leaders is one of the key symptoms of low EI. There's other things that we've been talking about in the prior workshops around permissive behavior of leaders, but again, it's you can really see that low EI coming out, and that subjective rationalization, right? It's just they don't want me to do it, or they don't want me to lead it, or they're going to get upset with me if I do change, if I do decide to lead them. So it allows them to let themselves off the hook, as opposed to saying, okay, I need to develop up my ability to tolerate how I feel in these interactions so I can remain effective in leading. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense on that example. On the flip side of it, I'm going to talk about how low EI shows up in autocratic behavior that leads to disengagement, right? So a client of mine who is in a very senior role within an organization brought a brand new employee in to a role with a fair amount of complexity. The individual did have a really, really good skill set. And she was so focused on making sure that everything was done exactly how she wanted it done. She would edit and re-edit and revise the work that her staff put forward to her. She would, again, this is low EI, because her inability to sort of tolerate things being out of her control. So she wasn't aware of what she was doing. And so she had moved into essentially micromanaging in that autocratic behavior, because again, that no emotional intelligence, not being self-aware, not recognizing what's going on with her. And so how that fear in her and that need to be in control, she wasn't managing it effectively. She was just working off of that emotion, and that emotion was driving her behavior. So this new employee of hers came in and really over time had her confidence diminished, because she felt like she could never do anything right, because her boss was always ripping her work apart and rewriting it or redoing it or taking back because it wasn't done exactly the way she wanted it to do. So this again became about the employee not being effective, as opposed to the leader looking at her own behavior and her lack of emotional intelligence, her low emotional intelligence in this case, that was then driving her to move into micromanage, as opposed to, and having absolutely no empathy of what that experience was like for the employee and their ability to feel safe. And so the employees started to work longer and longer hours, because they started to second guess themselves, and they wanted to get everything perfect to that point of perfection, and not realizing that that wasn't going to be possible, because the leader herself was unable to recognize how she was feeling and move out of those emotions or manage herself appropriately in those situations, right? And she was being driven again off of her own need for control and perfectionism. And so this is the dysfunction that starts to emerge, and you really see over time the level of engagement of this employee and their confidence and ultimately their performance just eroding over time. this was something that we could then move, and we did. We moved the needle on by working on that leader on her emotional intelligence and her way to be more aware of the impact of her behavior on her people. So when she moved into this need to, control every detail, she started to learn how to talk about that and to separate the person and the work that they'd done from it so that it was depersonalized. So she started to employ a number of strategies and be more attuned to when she was shifting into that, what was triggering her, and her ability to manage through that process. Didn't mean that she didn't still go into it, but the impact, she started to work on the impact of that on her people by being more aware of it and also having some new self-management strategies for it. The last example that I'm going to talk about in low EI relates to impulse control. And this can come out in all sorts of ways, but one of the key signs that we've got leaders with low impulse control is that low EI is that they are showing signs of an inability to effectively manage their impulses. And it can come in a couple of different ways. So managing the impulse to dump on somebody, right? So just, this is what I'm feeling, I'm frustrated, and so I'm going to yell at the person. And again, we have situations like this that do happen in our client organizations and people blowing up. It can also happen on the flip side with, I remember working with a senior leader, and, she would actually break down in tears because it would build up and she wouldn't be able to manage the impulse around it. And then she needed to find that release for it. But it also shows up in missing deadlines, in, I'm just thinking about one example where they just wanted to, wanted to keep doing it. So their impulse was to keep doing it the way they've always done it. The impulse was, I don't want to stop. I don't want to slow down. And so they're driven by that and not realizing that they're not managing their impulses in order to step back and say, actually, I need to plan. I need to work with my team as opposed to going off and doing it individually. I need to shift my focus here. So it's that poor impulse control, right? Where we just go straight from thinking to doing or feeling to doing without sort of stopping in and saying, well, wait a minute, what's in my best interest here? And what's the best approach? And how do I plan this? And how do I, I'm just thinking of another example of a client who was extremely frustrated and went into his boss's office and just dumped all over his boss. Again, that's poor impulse control. That comes from low emotional intelligence because they just feel that drive to act without any consideration of the impact that that's going to have if they move into action. And all of those pieces, self-awareness, the impulse control being part of self-management, the other awareness, how this is going to land, what is this going to do for me reputationally? How is this going to demotivate my staff? If my staff see me behaving like this, I have another client who will get frustrated and they'll go on a rant in front of all of their direct reports about their peers. And again, that's poor impulse control. There's a time and a place for that. There's an audience where it's appropriate. I heard a story today of a client where one of their direct reports was coming into him to have him have a conversation with somebody else, where as opposed to directly going over and having the conversation themselves, right? So again, that's poor impulse control. Is my impulse is to avoid and ignore, and I'm giving into that impulse as opposed to saying, again, what's going to be most effective for me? What's going to be most productive? How do I want to move these things forward? The effective use, so these are just a couple of examples and easy to start to pick up different ways in which these things show in organizations. But the dysfunction of low EI is one that is prevalent. It can be in teams, it can be across the organization. If your engagement results, again, are low, this is a place to start, is really thinking about where are your leaders at in terms of their emotional intelligence. The thing about the effective use of emotional intelligence, because that's what this is about, actually allows leaders to shift their leadership style, to adapt into the situation and to be more effective, because they can, it allows them to increase their conflict management and their persuasiveness. It allows them to be more effective when it comes to change management, influence, solutioning. I mean, I had a conversation with a client a couple of days ago where, they were all complaining about something, low EI at work. They were all complaining about something. And I said, look, you're the leaders. If you don't like it, then fix it. And they all sort of looked at me and then they went back to complaining, right? So this is that thing of that when they're not using their EI to say, oh, wait a minute, what, I'm complaining. Why am I complaining? What is it that I need to do to problem solve this? They get stuck again in this pattern and in their emotions and in their emotional brain, right? We know that self-aware leaders are just more likely to have insight into how to motivate and influence the behavior of their employees. And it also helps to manage their own emotions. Again, not control them, not ignore them, to manage their own emotions, especially in those emotional aspects of communication. Because if we're looking at employee engagement, if we're looking at fostering that sense of belonging, about being authentic as leaders, there is an emotional side to communication. Developing emotional intelligence, though, it takes time. It takes reflection. It requires feedback and practice, okay? And you need to, if you're one of those leaders who's ready now to get on the road to developing your EI, if you're looking for some solutions for your leaders in your organization to move the needle on their EI so that you can eliminate this silent killer of employee engagement, there's a couple of steps and a couple of places to start. First and foremost, we always recommend really understanding your leadership style. So using a psychometric assessment such as ours, the Striving Styles Personality System, or the Myers-Briggs, to really understand the mechanics of your mind, right? So how are you hardwired? What are the functions that you're going to rely on? And what are those natural behavioral preferences that you have in your leadership style? And so what does it mean that you need to develop, okay? It determines the natural approach, okay? These leadership assessments determine the natural approach that we're going to take to leading and serves as the basis for our development plan. So for example, if using Myers-Briggs language, if you're an ESTJ, then, those aspects around communication, empathy, collaboration, conflict resolution, those are all rooted in the opposite function to your predominant. And so those are going to be places that you need to develop, but you can't go straight into that. You're gonna have to work and practice by using some of the other aspects of your personality. But the leadership assessments are really the first step in building self-awareness. The second piece is leveraging emotional intelligence training and leadership coaching. We want the training around emotional intelligence because that emphasizes some of the practical application of EI concepts and really gets you familiarized and oriented to the theory around emotional intelligence. But through individual coaching, that's where you start to really apply those EI skills that are at the core to achieving that personal awareness and to be able to work through your own resistance. Because again, developing our EI is going to trigger resistance in ourselves, in our brains. And so the coaching really helps you to move forward with that personal awareness, connecting with others, managing impulses, all of those pieces, optimism, exhibiting resilience, but having that aspect of being able to really look at your own situations and where you're not demonstrating effective use of emotional intelligence. And as I said before, about working through your own resistance. The other thing we highly recommend is practicing mindfulness to develop emotional intelligence, because the practice of mindfulness allows leaders to manage their emotions and their impulses. So it's about responding, not reacting to what's going on, including to others, as well as not reacting to one's own triggers for greater self-management to really get into that skillful engagement of employees. So mindfulness and some of the mindfulness techniques are really, really useful in our minds. They go hand in hand with developing up our emotional intelligence. At the end of the day, by developing emotional intelligence, leaders gain greater enjoyment. Actually, they get more pleasure, they can have more fun basically with the people side of leadership because it doesn't produce the same reaction in them and they're able to really manage their way through it. At the same time, they're able to build up that psychological safety that I talked about that's so important. And through a genuine expression of caring, not just about the work, but how employees feel and experience the work. In our book, as I mentioned before, So You Think You Can Lead, the first 2 pillars of the 6 pillars of leading with authority, are all about emotional intelligence competencies. And our programs always use this as the starting point. Leadership awareness, so becoming aware of your leadership style, followed by a deep dive into emotional intelligence. Because you have to understand the emotional drivers of your behavior. You have to build that self-awareness if you're going to move out of this dysfunction of low EI and the killing off of employee engagement. Without emotional intelligence, all we can do, all we can hope for is to be good leaders, but we really ultimately end up failing ourselves and our people. If you're looking for more information about leadership dysfunctions and organizational dysfunction, check out our videos on our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard. Our podcast series, if you haven't listened to any of the episodes, it's all about organizational dysfunction. It's called Dismantling Dysfunction, and you can find it on any one of your favorite podcast platforms, but also on our website, Dranitsaris-Hilliard.com. And again, check out the pillars of leading with authority in So You Think You Can Lead. Great book that really helps you, sets you on the road for developing your competencies, including the emotional intelligence ones that are so essential for leading with authority and leading authentically at the end of the day. So I hope you enjoyed this workshop. Happy to hear from you. If you have any comments or feedbacks, even if you're catching this in the replay, thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.